The moment the glass elevator doors opened on the 23rd floor of Cascade Technologies should have been just another ordinary instant in Seattle's corporate routine. But when that scent hit his senses, Alexander Hunt felt every muscle in his body react with an intensity that caught him completely off guard. 3 weeks. 21 days since that night at the Aria Resort that he had unsuccessfully tried to erase from his memory. And now, as his eyes swept across the modern office environment, he knew, with absolute certainty, that she was there. Claire Madison had spent the last 15 minutes trying to focus on the quarterly report open on her screen, but the words danced around without making any sense. Her heart had been pounding against her ribs ever since she received the email summoning all executives to the new CEO's introductory meeting. The company's acquisition had been announced 3 weeks ago, precisely when she was in Las Vegas for the annual tech conference. Precisely when her life had been turned upside down by an impulsive decision that didn't at all align with her meticulously organized personality. The low hum of nervous conversations filled the main conference room. Claire adjusted her gray blazer for the 3rd time in 2 minutes, crossing and uncrossing her legs under the polished mahogany table. To her left, Marcus Chen, director of operations and her closest friend at the company, anxiously shuffled papers unnecessarily. "You're pale," he murmured, leaning discreetly toward her. "Still worried about your division's future?" Claire forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. If Marcus knew her paleness had nothing to do with corporate restructurings and everything to do with the ghost of a night she couldn't forget, he'd probably be shocked. Claire Madison, the vice president of product development, who hadn't missed a single day of work in 6 years, who reviewed contracts until midnight and kept her personal life as organized as her spreadsheets, had done something completely irrational in Vegas. She had spent the night with a complete stranger. Not just any night. The most intense, most alive, most absolutely unforgettable night of her existence. And then, like a coward, she had fled at 5 in the morning, leaving behind only the trace of her Chanel No. 19 perfume in his hotel room. She left no note, no number. She simply vanished, returned to her perfectly structured life, and tried to convince herself that it had just been an aberration, a moment outside of reality that would have no consequences. Except the consequences had haunted her every night since then. In her dreams, in the memories that surfaced at the most inopportune moments, in the way her body still reacted remembering his touch, his husky voice whispering in her ear, the inexplicable connection that had bound them together in those stolen hours of dawn. "Attention, please." Patricia Reynolds's voice, the human resources director, cut through the anxious murmur. "CEO Alexander Hunt is on his way. I would like everyone to demonstrate to him the culture of excellence and professionalism we've built here at Cascade." Claire took a deep breath, raising her chin in a gesture she had mastered over years of navigating male-dominated corporate environments. Whoever this Alexander Hunt was, she would handle the situation with the same competence she applied to all professional challenges. Her division had the company's best results. Her products accounted for 40% of annual revenue. She had value. She had negotiating power. She had. The double doors opened, and Claire's world simply stopped. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But it was. Every inch of the body she had explored that night in Vegas, now impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary, his dark brown hair perfectly combed back, revealing the green eyes that had hypnotized her at the Aria bar, the strong jawline she had traced with her fingers, the lips that... Alexander Hunt stopped in the doorway. His eyes swept the room, quickly passing over the anxious faces of the executives until they met hers. And in that instant, Claire saw recognition flash across his features like lightning. She saw his nostrils flare slightly, inhaling the air. She saw the corner of his mouth curve into a slow smile, laden with memories and unfulfilled promises. She couldn't breathe. She literally couldn't force air into her lungs. "Good morning," His voice filled the space, deep and controlled, exactly as Claire remembered. It's a pleasure to be here and meet the team that has made Cascade one of the most innovative companies in the enterprise software segment. He moved through the room with the natural confidence of someone born to lead, greeting people, memorizing names with impressive ease. Claire forced herself to maintain composure, her hands tightly clasped on the table to hide her trembling. Marcus was saying something beside her, but the words reached her muffled, as if she were underwater. Alexander circled the table, approaching inexorably, 2 executives in front of him, 1 executive, and then he was before her, extending his hand with that controlled smile that revealed nothing to others, but which she could perfectly decipher. There was humor there, and desire, and something more dangerous that she didn't want to name. "Alexander Hunt," he said, as if she didn't know, as if his name hadn't echoed in her mind countless times over the last 3 weeks. Claire extended her hand, preparing for the contact. When his fingers enveloped hers, an electric current shot up her arm, the same devastating chemistry that had made her forget all her rules that night. "Claire Madison," she replied, impressed by the steadiness of her own voice. "Vice President of Product Development." His fingers squeezed hers for a fraction of a second longer than appropriate. "Ah, yes. I've read quite a bit about your work, Ms. Madison. Impressive results. I look forward to discussing your projects in detail." There was a veiled promise in those words that made Claire's stomach clench. He released her and continued his rounds, but Claire felt his eyes return to her repeatedly as he finished the introductions. When he finally took his place at the head of the table, Alexander clasped his hands and swept the group with a calculated gaze. "I'll be direct. I acquired Cascade because I see extraordinary potential. I'm not here to dismantle what you've built. I'm here to expand, but I demand excellence, transparency, and total dedication." His eyes landed on Claire again, and she felt the weight of that gaze down to her bones. "In the coming days, I will meet individually with each division leader. I want to deeply understand every aspect of this operation." Patricia distributed information packets while Alexander outlined his strategic vision. Claire forced herself to pay attention, making mechanical notes, but her mind spun in desperate circles. How had this happened? Of all companies, of all possible CEOs, how had fate conspired to place him exactly here? "Ms. Madison," Alexander's voice cut through her thoughts. She looked up, meeting those green eyes fixed on her with almost tangible intensity. "As your division represents our largest source of revenue, I'd like to start with you. My schedule is available later today. How about 5 o'clock this afternoon in my office?" It wasn't a request. It was a politely disguised order, and everyone in the room knew it. "Of course," Claire replied, maintaining a professional tone despite the growing panic. 5 o'clock is perfect." His smile widened imperceptibly. "Excellent. I eagerly await our conversation." The next 2 hours of the meeting were a refined torture. Claire participated when necessary, presented data when asked, but every cell in her body was hyper-aware of Alexander's presence, of the way he moved, gestured, commanded everyone's attention in the room with no apparent effort. She had known this man in a completely different version, vulnerable and intensely human. Now he was corporate power personified, and she worked for him. When the meeting finally ended, Claire practically fled to her office, ignoring Marcus's invitation to lunch. She closed the door, leaned against it, and let out the breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. Her phone vibrated, a message from an unknown internal number. "Chanel number 19. I'd recognize it anywhere. My office, 5 o'clock. Don't be late." The reflection in her office window showed a woman Claire barely recognized. The impeccable posture was still there, the gray blazer perfectly aligned, but there was something in her eyes that completely betrayed her. Panic, perhaps, or desire, possibly both, intertwined in a way she didn't know how to untangle. 3 hours and 45 minutes until the meeting. Claire forced herself to sit down, open her laptop, and review the quarterly reports she would need to present. The words on the screen might as well have been in Mandarin for all the sense they made. All she could see were those green eyes fixed on hers across the conference table. All she could feel were his fingers squeezing hers for that forbidden fraction of a second. Chanel number 19. I'd recognize it anywhere. She should have chosen another perfume today. She should have somehow anticipated that the universe would conspire to transform her meticulously built professional life into something as complicated as her personal life had become that morning in Vegas. A knock on the door made her jump in her chair. "Come in," she called, straightening up automatically. Marcus Chen slid into the office with 2 coffee cups, kicking the door shut behind him. He placed one of the cups on her desk and flopped into the visitor's chair with the familiarity of someone allowed to ignore formalities. "So," he began, raising his eyebrows in a way Claire knew all too well. "Want to tell me what was really going on in that room?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Claire picked up her coffee, grateful for the distraction, even if her hands still trembled slightly. "Claire, how long have you known me? 5 years? 6? Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes penetrating. "I saw the face you made when Alexander Hunt walked into that room, and more importantly, I saw the face he made when he saw you." Claire's stomach dropped. "You're imagining things." "Am I?" "Because it really looked like the two of you recognized each other, and not in the generic corporate, 'oh, I read your resume' sense." He paused, studying her with that annoying intelligence that made him so good at operations. "Do you know each other?" Claire took a long sip of coffee, using the time to calibrate her response. Marcus was her friend, perhaps the only true one she had at the office. But there were things she couldn't share, especially now that Alexander Hunt was the company's CEO. "I had never seen that man before today," she said, and technically, it was true. She had never seen Alexander Hunt, billionaire CEO. She had met Alex, the man at the Aria bar who had made her world spin off its axis for a few precious hours. Marcus watched her for a long moment, then sighed. "All right. Keep your secrets. But be careful, Claire. Hunt has a reputation for being ruthless in business. I read about him after the acquisition was announced. He builds empires, devours smaller companies, and doesn't tolerate weakness. If there's anything that could make you vulnerable." "There's nothing," Claire interrupted, perhaps too quickly. "My division has impeccable numbers. He has no reason to question me." "I'm not talking about numbers," Marcus's voice softened. "I'm talking about you. You looked like you were about to faint in that room." Claire forced a smile she hoped looked convincing. "Just normal nerves with the leadership change. It'll pass." But as Marcus eventually left her office, she knew it was a lie. It wouldn't pass. Not when she would have to sit alone in a room with the man who had explored every inch of her body, who had elicited sounds from her she didn't even know she could make, who had looked into her eyes at the height of pleasure as if he could see directly into her soul. The hours dragged on with torturous slowness. Claire tried to work. She really tried. She answered emails, reviewed project proposals, participated in a video conference with the development team. But a part of her mind remained stuck in that hotel room, reliving moments she had tried to bury. The way he had smiled when she approached him at the bar. The touch of his fingers tracing the line of her neck. His husky voice asking if she was sure, giving her one last chance to back out. And how she had leaned into him, forgetting all the rules that normally governed her life, choosing for once to be impulsive, to be free, to be someone beyond the always controlled vice president. At 4:45, Claire got up and walked to her office's private bathroom. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, seeing the shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't completely hide. She reapplied her lipstick, adjusted her hair pulled back into an elegant bun, took 3 deep breaths. "You can do this. It's just a business meeting. You've done hundreds of them." But never with a man who knew the taste of her skin. Alexander Hunt's office was on the 25th floor, 2 floors above hers. The elevator rose in silence, and Claire watched the numbers change on the digital display, each one seeming a step closer to something inevitable and possibly catastrophic. The doors opened to an elegant anteroom, completely renovated since she had last been there. Dark wood, polished glass, minimalist decor that screamed power and money. An assistant Claire didn't recognize was seated behind a contemporary desk. "Ms. Madison," the woman said with a professional smile. "Mr. Hunt is waiting. You may go in." Claire nodded, her legs moving toward the double wooden doors, even as every instinct screamed at her to run in the opposite direction. She knocked twice, firm and confident. "Come in." That voice. God. That voice still did things to her that shouldn't be allowed in a corporate environment. Claire pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a spectacular view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains in the background. Alexander stood near the windows, hands in his pockets, his silhouette outlined against the late afternoon light. When he turned, Claire noticed he had taken off his jacket. The sleeves of his white shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms she remembered all too well. "Claire." He said her name like a caress, and she hated the way her body immediately responded. "Close the door." She obeyed, keeping her hand on the doorknob for an extra second to steady herself. When she turned back, Alexander had approached, stopping just a few steps from her. Close enough for her to feel his warmth, the scent of his expensive cologne mixed with something fundamentally masculine that was uniquely his. "I think we have a lot to talk about," he said softly, his green eyes studying every inch of her face. Claire raised her chin, forcing herself to maintain eye contact. "If it's about the product development division, I've brought the latest reports and projections for the next quarter." His lips curved into a slow smile that made her stomach knot. "Ah, Claire, are we really going to pretend it's just about work? What else could it be about?" She kept her voice firm, professional. "You're my new CEO. I run an important division. This is a business meeting." "Is it?" He took a step closer, and she found herself caught between his body and the door behind her. He didn't touch her, keeping his hands decently away, but the proximity was suffocating, intoxicating. "Then why is your heart racing? I can see your pulse beating here." He raised his hand, his fingers stopping inches from her neck, tracing the air without making contact. "You're invading my personal space," Claire said, but her voice came out husky, completely betraying her. "Am I?" Alexander tilted his head, his eyes dancing with something dangerous and provocative. "Because I remember you inviting exactly that kind of invasion. You begging for it, actually." Heat flooded Claire's face, a combination of shame and desire she couldn't separate. That was different. That was. "A night in Vegas," he completed, his voice growing more serious. "A moment outside of reality that shouldn't have consequences." Claire swallowed hard, unable to respond. Alexander stepped back half a pace, creating space between them, but his eyes remained fixed on hers with unwavering intensity. "You ran away, Claire. I woke up, and you had disappeared like a ghost. No note, no number, no explanation. Just the perfume on the pillow and the memory of the most incredible night I've ever had." The words hit her like physical blows. She had run, yes, in panic and confusion in the gray light of dawn, because it had been too intense, too real, and she didn't know how to process something so completely beyond her control. "I didn't know who you were," she finally whispered. "And if you had known," Alexander asked, raising an eyebrow, "would you have stayed? Or would you still have run?" The honest answer was that she didn't know. So Claire did the only thing she knew how to do when faced with situations she couldn't control. She retreated into professionalism, into the rules and structures that governed her corporate world. "That's irrelevant now. You're my CEO. I work for you. What happened in Vegas can't interfere with that." "It can't?" His voice was low, almost a challenge. "Because I think it already is interfering, Claire. I think it's been interfering since the moment I smelled your perfume in that elevator today." The silence that followed Alexander's words was dense, laden with everything that wasn't being said. Claire felt the weight of those green eyes on her, studying every reaction, every breath, as if he could read the thoughts she struggled to keep hidden. "We need to establish professional boundaries," she finally said, forcing firmness into her voice. "What happened in Las Vegas cannot define our working relationship." Alexander took a step back, creating more distance between them, but the smile on his lips wasn't one of agreement. It was one of challenge. Professional boundaries, of course. He turned and walked to the imposing desk, picking up a folder. "Now let's discuss business. Please have a seat." Claire crossed the office with measured steps, choosing one of the leather chairs in front of his desk. She opened her own folder, grateful to have something concrete to focus on. Numbers, charts, projections, things that made sense in a world that suddenly seemed to have lost all logic. Alexander didn't sit behind the desk as she expected. Instead, he leaned against the edge, positioning himself closer to her than he would in a traditional setup. It was a position of power, but also of intimacy, and Claire recognized the tactic for what it was. "Your numbers are impressive," he began, leafing through the report she had sent earlier. 42% of the company's total revenue, 23% year-over-year growth. Customer retention rate above 90%. His eyes met hers. "You've built something remarkable here." "We built it," Claire corrected automatically. "My team is exceptional." Humility. Interesting. Alexander tilted his head. "That's not what your record shows. You're competitive, ambitious, and you don't hesitate to take credit where it's due. At least not according to the last 5 years of performance reviews I've reviewed." Claire felt a flush creep up her neck. "You read my personal files?" "I read the files of all key executives. It's my job to know the people who keep this company running." He paused, his fingers lightly drumming on the report. "But I admit, I paid special attention to yours. That's not appropriate." "No." His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "What isn't appropriate, Claire? Me knowing the professional history of my vice president of development? Or the fact that while I read about your corporate achievements, all I can think about is how you sounded when—" "Stop." The word came out louder than Claire intended. She took a deep breath, fighting for composure. "You can't do this. You can't mix the two." Alexander was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, something more serious, less provocative. "You're right. I apologize." He finally moved behind the desk, creating a physical barrier between them. "That wasn't professional of me." The change in his demeanor caught her off guard. Claire expected him to continue the teasing, the cat-and-mouse game. She didn't expect a genuine apology. "Thank you," she said cautiously. Alexander opened his laptop on the desk, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "Let's do this differently. You mentioned 3 new products in development. Tell me about Project Horizon." Claire blinked, recalibrating. He was actually shifting to a genuine business discussion. Part of her felt relieved. Another part, a part she didn't want to examine too closely, felt something dangerously close to disappointment. "Horizon is our foray into artificial intelligence for supply chain management," she began, finding familiar ground. "We're 8 months away from beta launch. Initial tests with selected clients have shown a 35% reduction in operational costs. Impressive. And the competition? TechVision is developing something similar, but we're at least a year ahead of them in terms of functionality." Alexander asked more questions, detailed and insightful, that revealed a deep knowledge of the industry. Claire found herself gradually relaxing, losing herself in the discussion of something she knew intimately. This was her comfort zone, where she had control and confidence. "Have you considered expanding into the European market?" Alexander asked after 40 minutes of technical analysis. "We have considered it, but the costs of localization and regulatory compliance are significant. We would need additional investment. And if that investment were available?" Claire paused, studying him. Then yes, absolutely. The European market represents a growth opportunity of approximately 200 million in annual revenue. Alexander leaned back in his chair, fingers intertwined under his chin. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking I'm looking for. You have vision, Claire, and the executive ability to turn that vision into reality. The compliment warmed her in a way she hadn't expected. Thank you. There's a conference in Boston next week. Summitech Innovate. All the major industry players will be there, including potential European distribution partners. His eyes met hers across the desk. I want you to go. With me. Claire's heart skipped a beat. With you. You know the products better than anyone. It makes sense for the person leading development to be present for these strategic conversations. His voice was perfectly professional, but there was something in his eyes that suggested additional layers. Unless you have any objections. Claire knew she should object. Traveling with him, being in another city away from the office and the gaze of colleagues, seemed dangerous in ways she didn't want to contemplate. But professionally, he was right. It was an opportunity she couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. No objections, she said, keeping her voice neutral. When do we leave? Monday morning. My assistant will coordinate the details with you. Alexander closed his laptop, signaling the end of the meeting. There's one more thing. Claire waited, her self-preservation instinct suddenly on high alert. The night in Vegas, he said, his voice carefully controlled. I understand you want to keep it separate from work, and I will respect that. But I won't pretend it didn't happen, and I won't pretend I don't think about it. Alexander, let me finish. He stood up, moving to the windows, turning his back to her. You affected me in a way I didn't expect, and when you disappeared I tried to forget. I really did. But then I stepped into that elevator today and your scent was there, and it was like all those hours came rushing back at once. Claire didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to run. Another part wanted to go to him, touch his shoulder, admit that she had felt exactly the same. But you're right, he continued, still with his back turned. We have to work together. So here's what I propose. During business hours, in this office, I am your CEO, and you are my vice president. Total professionalism. No references to the past, no games, business only. And after business hours, Claire asked, before she could stop herself. Alexander turned, and the intensity in his eyes made the air leave her lungs. After business hours, I'd like the chance to get to know you properly. Not in a hotel room in Vegas where we were both pretending to be other people, but here, in real life. Are you asking me out? Eventually, yes, but not today. Not when you're still processing all of this. He took a step toward her, but maintained a respectful distance. What I'm asking for is consideration, that you don't dismiss what happened between us as a mistake, because for me, it wasn't. The raw honesty of his words completely disarmed her. Claire found herself standing, though she didn't remember deciding to get up. Alexander, this is complicated. Company policies regarding relationships between superiors and subordinates. They can be navigated, if both parties want to. And what if I say I don't want to? She forced the words out, testing, perhaps testing herself as much as him. His eyes darkened with something that looked like pain, but he nodded. Then I would respect that. I would keep everything strictly professional. But you would have to look me in the eye and tell me that you didn't feel what I felt that night. That you don't still feel it. Claire opened her mouth, ready to do exactly that. To lie convincingly and build the walls that would keep her safe in her professional comfort zone. But the words didn't come, because he was right. She had felt it. She still felt it, and lying about it seemed impossible when he looked at her that way. I need to think, she said finally. Fair enough. Alexander moved back behind the desk, and Claire recognized the transition. He was retreating to professional ground again. You have my number now. If you need anything work-related before Monday, don't hesitate to reach out. It was a clear dismissal. Claire picked up her folder, moving toward the door on legs that felt less steady than they should. As she reached the threshold, her hand on the doorknob, his voice stopped her. Claire? She looked over her shoulder. For the record, you're wrong about one thing. What? You said it was different. That Vegas was different. His eyes held hers across the space between them. But it wasn't. Not for me. You were exactly who I saw today. Strong, intelligent, incredibly capable. The only difference is that night, you allowed yourself to be vulnerable too. And it was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Claire left the office before he could see the effect those words had on her. Claire Madison's apartment was a perfect reflection of her professional life. Impeccably organized. Decorated with minimalist taste, every object in its designated place. But on that Friday night, as she tossed her bag onto the white leather sofa and kicked off her shoes, the exterior order violently contrasted with the chaos reigning in her mind. 3 days. 3 days since that meeting in Alexander's office, and she hadn't been able to stop thinking about his words. You were exactly who I saw today. Strong, intelligent, incredibly capable. The only difference is that night, you allowed yourself to be vulnerable too. Claire poured herself a generous glass of red wine and walked to the windows overlooking downtown Seattle. The city lights twinkled like earthly stars, and somewhere out there, Alexander Hunt was in his own apartment, or perhaps still working, or dining with some important contact. She didn't know. She shouldn't care, but she did, and that annoyed her deeply. Her phone vibrated on the coffee table. A message from Marcus. Drinks tomorrow? You look like you need a night off. Claire smiled slightly. Marcus knew her too well. But before she could reply, another notification popped up. A corporate email from Alexander's assistant, detailing the travel arrangements for Boston. Flight at 7 a.m., Monday, Fairmont Copley Plaza Hotel. 3 nights. Meeting agenda attached. She opened the attachment, scanning the appointments. Monday afternoon, meeting with TechBridge Solutions executives. Tuesday morning, a panel on artificial intelligence at the conference. Tuesday evening, dinner with potential European investors. All perfectly professional, carefully planned. But then her eyes landed on the last line. Note: hotel bookings for separate rooms, same floor, as requested by Mr. Hunt. Something tightened in her chest. He was being careful, deliberately appropriate, giving her space even when they would be in the same city, away from the office. It was exactly what she should want. But instead of relief, she felt something irritatingly close to disappointment. The weekend passed in a fog of failed attempts to relax. Claire went to the gym Saturday morning, pushing her body to its limit in a spinning class that left her legs trembling. She accepted drinks with Marcus that night, listening to him talk about his new girlfriend while feigning genuine interest. On Sunday, she cleaned her already impeccable apartment, reorganized her closet, and reviewed presentations for Boston at least 5 times. When Monday dawned, she had been awake since 5, having given up trying to sleep. She chose a travel outfit carefully: black tailored pants, a gray silk blouse, a structured blazer. Professional, confident, completely in control, or at least appearing to be. The driver Alexander had arranged arrived exactly at 6. Claire was about to get into the car when her phone rang. Alexander's number. Good morning. His deep voice sent a shiver down her spine. Change of plans. We're taking my private jet. More privacy to discuss strategy during the flight. Claire paused, hand on the car door. Your private jet. It's more efficient, and I apologize for the last-minute notice. The decision was made last night. There was a note of something in his voice she couldn't quite place. Amusement, challenge. The driver knows where to go. I'll see you at the hangar. The call ended before she could protest. The executive hangar at Boeing Field was a completely different world from the commercial travel experience. Claire was escorted through a private entrance where an assistant took her luggage with a professional smile. And then she saw him. Alexander was at the foot of the jet's stairs, talking to what appeared to be the pilot. He had swapped his full suit for tailored pants and a light blue shirt without a tie, sleeves rolled up, revealing those forearms that inhabited her most inconvenient dreams. When he saw her, he said something to the pilot and walked towards her. "Punctual as ever," he said, his eyes raking over her in a way that should have been inappropriate but instead made her stomach clench. "Ready?" "You could have mentioned the private jet when we discussed this trip," Claire said, keeping her voice neutral as they ascended the stairs. "And would you have objected?" He followed her, close enough for her to feel his presence. "Yes." "Exactly why I didn't mention it." There was humor in his voice. "Sometimes, Claire, you need to accept that some things are out of your control." The jet's interior was exactly what she would expect from a billionaire. Cream leather, polished wood, state-of-the-art technology. But it was smaller and more intimate than she had anticipated. A seating area with facing armchairs, a table between them. There was no way to maintain physical distance here. Alexander gestured to one of the armchairs. "Coffee? Tea? There's a full menu if you haven't had breakfast yet." "Coffee? Black." Claire settled in, placing her folder on the table as a symbolic barrier between them. He poured 2 cups from an elegant thermos, handing one to her before sitting in the opposite armchair. For a moment, they simply looked at each other as the jet began to move, taxiing toward the runway. "Thank you for coming," Alexander said finally. "I know this is complicated." "Work is work," Claire replied, but the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "Is it?" He leaned back, studying her with that intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Because I have the impression that you barely slept this weekend. And before you ask how I know, you have small shadows under your eyes that your makeup doesn't completely hide, and you're holding that coffee cup like it's a lifeline." Claire forced herself to relax her fingers around the warm porcelain. "I was reviewing material for the meetings." "Of course you were." He took a sip of his own coffee, and she hated how fascinated she was by the movement of his throat. "Claire, we can do this 2 ways. We can spend the next 4 hours pretending there's only work between us, tense and uncomfortable, or we can be honest with each other." "Honest about what?" "About the fact that this weekend was hell for me too. That I rewrote my speech for the conference 6 times because I couldn't focus. That every time I tried to focus on work, all I saw was you in that office on Friday, looking at me as if I were simultaneously the best and worst thing that had ever happened to you." The jet gained speed, and Claire felt the acceleration press her back against the seat. Or perhaps it was his words. "Alexander, I know I said I would respect your boundaries," he continued, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "And I will respect them. But before I spend the next 72 hours pretending to be just your CEO, I need a few minutes of honesty first." The jet left the ground, and Claire watched Seattle disappear below them through the window. When she finally looked back at Alexander, there was something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Vulnerability, raw and disarming. "What do you want me to say?" she asked softly. "I want you to tell me what made you run that morning in Vegas. Not the corporate answer about professional boundaries. The truth." Claire closed her eyes, letting her head fall back against the armchair. She could lie, she could deflect, or she could give him what he was asking for. Honesty. "I ran because I got scared," she said finally, opening her eyes to find him watching her with total attention. "I don't do things like that, Alexander. I don't spend nights with strangers. I don't lose control. I've built my entire life around being disciplined, focused, professional. And then in a few hours, you made all those rules disappear as if they'd never existed. And that scared you. It terrified me." She let out a humorless laugh. I woke up that morning and for a moment I just looked at you sleeping, and I realized I didn't know your last name. I didn't know where you lived or what you did, but I knew the sound of your laugh. I knew how your breathing changed well, I knew intimate things about you, but none of the basic facts. And it felt so wrong and so right at the same time that I couldn't process it. Alexander didn't say anything for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. I felt the same way. That's why when I woke up and you weren't there, it was like a punch to the gut. Because in those hours, it didn't matter who we were in the real world. It was just us. But we can't just be us, Claire said, reality settling in again. You're my CEO. There are policies, there are power dynamics, there are complications. I know. He stood up, moving to the window, watching the clouds pass by. But Claire, if I've learned anything from building companies from the ground up, it's that the best things are rarely simple. They require careful navigation, strategic planning, and a willingness to take calculated risks. She stood up too, though she wasn't sure why. Are you applying business logic to personal relationships? He turned, and she found herself closer to him than she intended in the confined space of the jet. I'm applying business logic to the fact that you are the most fascinating person I've ever met, and I'm not ready to just let that go because it's complicated. And what if I say it's not worth the risk? Claire challenged, though her heart was racing. Then I would accept your decision, but you would have to truly believe that. And something tells me you don't. He raised his hand, pausing inches from her face. May I? Claire should have said no. She should have pulled back, re-established boundaries, protected the career she had so carefully built. But instead, she found herself nodding. His fingers touched her face with a gentleness that contrasted with the intensity in his eyes. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing her lower lip, and Claire felt every nerve ending in her body awaken. 3 days, he murmured. Just 3 days, and you leave me completely unable to think straight. 3 weeks for me, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Since Vegas. The tension between them was almost physical, a force field pulling them together while reason screamed at them to pull away. Alexander leaned in, his forehead touching hers, their breaths mingling. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice raw with contained desire. Claire opened her mouth, rational words forming, but what came out was, I don't want you to stop. And then he was kissing her, and it was exactly as she remembered and completely knew at the same time. The touch of his lips on hers was soft, yet urgent, a question and an answer simultaneously. Her hands found his shirt, pulling him closer, and he responded by wrapping an arm around her waist, pressing her against his solid body. The kiss deepened, 3 weeks of denial and desire pouring into that moment. Claire lost herself in it, in how he tasted of coffee and something essentially masculine, in how his body fit perfectly against hers, in how every touch made her blood boil. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Alexander rested his forehead against hers again, eyes still closed. This changes everything, he said softly. I know. Claire took a step back, needing distance to think clearly. Her legs trembled slightly. What do we do now? Alexander ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing his own agitation. Now we go to Boston. We do our job brilliantly, and when we return, we figure out how to navigate this the right way. The right way, Claire repeated. Is there a right way when you're my boss? There's always a way when both people want to find it. He returned to the armchair, but there was something different in his posture now. Less controlled, more human. Claire, I'm not asking you to risk your career. I'm asking for a chance for us to explore this without guilt or fear. She returned to her own armchair, her legs still not entirely reliable. What about company policies? They will be followed. Transparency with HR, appropriate documentation, No professional preferential treatment. He held her gaze. But I won't lie and say I don't want this, that I don't want you. The rest of the flight passed in a strange mix of professional conversation and moments charged with unresolved tension. They reviewed agendas for the conference, discussed strategies for meetings, and on the surface looked exactly as they should. CEO and vice president preparing for important business events. But beneath the surface, something had irreversibly changed, and when the jet began to descend, the Fairmont Copley Plaza stood imposing against Boston's gray sky, a classic brick structure contrasting with the modern skyscrapers around it. Claire Madison watched the historic facade from the car window as they approached, her stomach tightening in a knot of anticipation and nervousness. The kiss on the jet had fundamentally changed something between her and Alexander, and now, about to spend 3 days in the same city, in the same hotel, she wasn't sure if she was ready for the consequences of that change. Alexander was on the phone beside her, discussing last-minute details with someone from the acquisitions team in Seattle. His voice was firm and authoritative, completely professional. But when his eyes met hers for a brief moment, Claire saw the warmth there, the memory of what had transpired between them hours earlier. Check-in was efficient, discreet. The hotel manager recognized Alexander immediately, personally escorting them to the private elevators. Claire maintained a respectable distance, aware of the hotel staff's curious glances. In the corporate world, appearances mattered as much as reality. 12th floor, Alexander told the manager. Rooms 1203 and 1205. Adjoining rooms, Claire noted. Not vaguely on the same floor, but literally right next to each other. She wasn't sure if that comforted her or made her more anxious. The manager left them in an elegantly decorated hallway, with damask wallpaper and thick carpet that muffled footsteps. Alexander stopped in front of room 1203, inserting his key card before turning to her. First meeting is in 2 hours, he said, his voice carefully neutral. TechBridge Solutions in the financial district. I have a car reserved for 1:45. I'll be ready. Claire took her own key, moving toward room 1205. But before she could open the door, his voice stopped her. Claire. She looked over her shoulder. Alexander hesitated, and it was strange to see uncertainty in that usually confident man. About what happened on the jet. I don't regret it. But if you need space, time to process, I understand. Claire studied him for a long moment, this complicated man who had entered her life like a hurricane. I don't regret it either, she said softly. But you're right. I need to think. He nodded, accepting that, and disappeared into his own room. Claire's room was luxurious, with antique furniture mixed with modern amenities, a king-size bed with absurdly soft-looking sheets, and windows offering views of Copley Square. She set her suitcase on the floor and went to the bathroom, splashing cold water on her face in an attempt to clear her head. The reflection in the mirror showed a woman who seemed in control, but whose eyes revealed inner turmoil. She had worked so hard to get where she was. 6 years building her reputation at Cascade Technologies, proving her worth in an industry that still favored men. And now she was risking everything for what? For a man she barely knew, but who somehow seemed to know her better than most people who had been in her life for years. Her phone vibrated. A message from Alexander. Additional documents for the meeting. Can I stop by your room? Claire hesitated, then replied, yes. 30 seconds later, a knock on the door. When she opened it, Alexander was there with a folder under his arm, his tie now in place, completely corporate again. Except for his eyes, which swept over her in a way that made her pulse quicken. I contacted our legal department, he said, stepping inside as she moved aside to let him pass. They sent over some contractual clauses TechBridge wants to discuss. He opened the folder on the desk, spreading out documents, and Claire moved closer to examine them. They stood side by side, shoulders almost touching, discussing technical terms and negotiation strategies. It was familiar, comfortable, the type of professional collaboration Claire excelled at. But then his arm brushed hers, and the awareness of the touch cut through all her concentration. Alexander paused mid-sentence, his eyes meeting hers. They were too close, the space between them charged with everything left unsaid. "We should focus," Claire said, but her voice came out hoarse. "We should," Alexander agreed, but he didn't move. "Claire, I need to know where we stand. I can't spend the next 3 days without understanding what you're thinking." She stepped back, needing distance to form coherent thoughts. "I'm thinking this is crazy, that there are so many reasons why it shouldn't work. You're my boss. There are policies. There's potential gossip that could undermine my credibility. And despite all that," he interrupted softly. Claire turned to face him. "Despite all that, I can't stop thinking about you. I can't forget what it was like to be with you that night, and I can't pretend that Kiss Today didn't happen or that I don't want it to happen again." The honesty of her own words surprised her. She wasn't someone who admitted vulnerability easily, but with Alexander, it seemed impossible to be anything but honest. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, his hands framing her face. "Then don't pretend, not with me." And then he was kissing her again, and Claire lost herself in the sensation. Her hands found his shoulders, pulling him closer, and he responded by deepening the kiss, one hand sliding to the nape of her neck. It was different from the kiss on the jet, slower, more deliberate, as if he was memorizing every detail. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Alexander rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "This is going to complicate everything," Claire whispered. "I know." He pulled back, his hands still gentle on her face. "But some complications are worth it." The clock on the nightstand showed 1:15. They had half an hour before they needed to leave for the meeting. Alexander seemed to notice at the same time, his eyes going to the clock and then back to her. "We should get ready," he said, reluctance clear in his voice. Claire nodded, though part of her wanted to ignore responsibilities and stay exactly where she was. But she hadn't built her career by ignoring responsibilities. "Meet in the lobby?" 1:45. He moved toward the door, then paused. "Claire? Thank you for being honest with me." When he left, Claire stood in the middle of the room, her fingers touching her lips, still sensitive from the kiss. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The only option now was to move forward and discover where this path led. The meeting with TechBridge Solutions was surprisingly productive, considering Claire spent the first half hour struggling not to think about the kiss. But as soon as they entered the conference room of the elegant office in the financial district, something in her readjusted. This was what she did, where she shined. Business, strategy, closing deals. Alexander introduced her to the TechBridge executives with evident pride that warmed something in her chest. "Claire Madison leads our product development. She's the reason Cascade is 2 years ahead of the competition." The executives were 3 middle-aged men who initially directed most of their questions to Alexander, a corporate habit Claire knew well. But Alexander consistently redirected, establishing that she was the expert, that her words carried equal weight to his. "Ms. Madison can better explain the technical architecture," he would say. Or, "Let me hand this over to Claire, who personally oversaw this development." It was empowering and annoying at the same time. Empowering because he was genuinely respecting her expertise. Annoying because she shouldn't have needed a man to validate her words in the first place. But it worked. By the end of the 2 hours, they had outlined the terms of a potential partnership that could significantly expand Cascade's presence on the East Coast. "Drinks to celebrate?" one of the executives suggested as they were leaving. Alexander looked at Claire, a silent question in his eyes. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. He caught the signal. "We appreciate it, but we have another engagement tonight," he said softly. "But we'd love to continue these conversations tomorrow during the conference. In the car back to the hotel, Claire finally relaxed, letting her head fall back against the leather seat. That was easier than I expected. "You were brilliant." Alexander's voice had a warm quality that made her look at him. "The way you won them over when they started questioning the implementation timelines. They were skeptical, and you turned them into believers in 15 minutes. Claire felt a blush rise up her neck. "I just did my job." "No, you exceeded your job. There's a difference." He paused, and she felt the weight of his gaze even without looking directly. "Claire, I want to make something clear. What's between us personally has nothing to do with how much I value you professionally. You earned your place in this company and in that meeting purely on merit." The words touched something deep within her. It was what she needed to hear, the validation she didn't know she was looking for. "Thank you." The rest of the drive passed in comfortable silence. When they arrived at the hotel, the afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the historic city. In the lobby, Alexander paused. "Dinner?" he asked. "There's an excellent Italian restaurant 2 blocks from here." Claire knew she should say no, that she should keep her distance, process everything that was happening. But instead, she found herself nodding. "Give me half an hour to get ready." His eyes lit up. 30 minutes. I'll meet you here." In her room, Claire changed out of her business suit into a simple but elegant navy blue dress, letting her hair down from its professional bun. Looking at her reflection, she saw someone balanced between 2 worlds, the controlled executive and the woman who was learning to embrace moments of spontaneity. The restaurant was intimate, with low lights and discreetly spaced tables. Alexander had reserved a private corner, away from curious glances. They ordered wine and food, but Claire barely registered what she was eating. All her attention was on the man in front of her, on the way he spoke about his childhood in Boston, about building his first company at 24, about the mistakes that taught him more than his successes. "And Vegas?" Claire found herself asking. "Were you there for the conference too?" Alexander shook his head. "I was closing a different acquisition. The deal fell through at the last minute. I was frustrated, disappointed, and needed to decompress." His eyes met hers. "And then I saw you at the bar, and suddenly none of that mattered." Claire felt warmth spread through her chest. "I had just presented a keynote to 500 people. I should have been thrilled, but I felt empty. Like I had reached a major milestone, and there was no one to share it with." "And now?" he asked softly. "Now I don't know what I feel." She held his gaze, allowing him to see the confusion and desire intertwined within her. "Except that when I'm with you, I don't feel empty." His hand found hers across the table, fingers intertwining. It was a simple gesture, yet loaded with meaning. And when they finally left the restaurant hours later, walking through Boston's lit streets, Claire realized something had irreversibly changed. She had stopped fighting the inevitable, and finally started to accept what was growing between them, complications and all. Tuesday morning dawned with a fine mist covering Boston, and Claire woke with the sensation of being suspended between 2 worlds. The hotel room was silent, only the distant murmur of traffic penetrating through the thick windows. She lay still for a few minutes, reliving the previous night, dinner with Alexander, the walk through the lit streets, and how he had held her hand back to the hotel without saying anything, just allowing that moment to exist without complications. But complications were inevitable, she thought as she got up. Especially today, when she would be presenting the panel on artificial intelligence alongside Alexander, before hundreds of industry professionals. It was one thing to share intimate moments at discreet dinners. It was another entirely to maintain professionalism when every cell of her body was hyper-aware of his presence. Her phone vibrated on the nightstand. A message from Alexander. "Breakfast in room 1203 in 30 minutes. We need to review the presentation." Claire smiled despite her nerves. Of course he would frame it as work prep. She replied confirming and went to the bathroom, choosing an outfit that balanced authority and elegance, a charcoal grey dress with a structured blazer. She pulled her hair back into a low bun, applied subtle but polished makeup, and observed her reflection with critical eyes. The woman in the mirror looked confident, controlled. No one would know the emotional chaos simmering beneath the surface. When she knocked on Alexander's door exactly 30 minutes later, he opened it immediately, as if he had been waiting on the other side. He was wearing tailored pants and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his hair still slightly damp from showering. The aroma of his cologne mixed with fresh coffee made something clench in Claire's chest. "Punctual as ever," he said, stepping aside to let her in. A breakfast tray was laid out on the table near the window, more elaborate than necessary for a simple work review. Claire raised an eyebrow. "This looks like more than just coffee and toast. I thought you might not have time for a proper breakfast." There was something almost shy in his expression that completely disarmed her. "And I wanted a few minutes with you before we were surrounded by hundreds of people." She approached the table, observing the fresh croissants, sliced fruit, Greek yogurt with granola. "Alexander Hunt, are you taking care of me?" "Possibly." He poured coffee into 2 cups, adding exactly the amount she liked without needing to ask. He had paid attention. "Is that a crime?" Claire accepted the cup, her fingers brushing his. "No, it's just unexpected." They sat down and for a few minutes just ate in comfortable silence. Claire discovered she was hungry, that she hadn't eaten properly the night before because she was too focused on her conversation with Alexander. Now, in the soft morning light, there was something deeply intimate about sharing that simple meal. "About today's presentation," Alexander began, shifting to professional territory. "I thought you could open by discussing the current industry challenges, and then I can transition to how our approach differs." Claire nodded, appreciating how he naturally put her in a prominent position. "And we'll conclude with the case study of the implementation at Cascade. The numbers are impressive enough to capture attention." They spent the next half hour refining the presentation, adjusting slides, debating points of emphasis. It was like dancing with a perfectly synchronized partner, each anticipating the other's moves, complementing ideas instead of competing. Claire realized she had forgotten what it was like to work with someone who truly respected her contributions, who didn't see her suggestions as threats, but as improvements. "You're remarkable at this, you know," Alexander said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about ROI metrics. Claire blinked. "Remarkable at what?" "At making complex concepts accessible without oversimplifying them. It's a rare gift." His eyes studied her with that intensity that always made her pulse quicken. "You should be doing this on a much larger scale. Keynote conferences, maybe even teaching." "I present at conferences regularly," she protested. But something warmed within her at the compliment. "I'm not talking about standard corporate presentations. I'm talking about you as a thought leader, shaping the future of the industry." He leaned forward. "Claire, you have vision. Not just for products, but for where technology is headed. People should be listening to you." The words touched something deep she had buried under years of just doing her job, keeping her head down, not drawing too much attention. When was the last time someone had seen, not just what she did, but the potential of what she could do? "I don't know if I'm ready for that kind of exposure," she admitted softly. "Then I'll remind you, until you are." The promise in his voice was solid, unwavering. The moment was broken by the alarm on Claire's phone. 1 hour until the presentation. Time to head to the convention center. The Heinz Convention Center was abuzz with industry professionals, all in impeccable business attire, milling among company booths and conference rooms. Claire and Alexander navigated the crowded lobby, occasionally pausing when someone recognized Alexander and wanted to chat. He handled each interaction with grace, but always kept Claire included, introducing her as an equal partner rather than a subordinate. The room where they were to present was almost full when they arrived, with at least 200 people seated in rows of chairs facing an elevated stage. Claire felt the familiar pre-presentation adrenaline rush, that mix of nervousness and excitement that always made her sharper. "Ready?" Alexander asked softly beside her backstage. Always. And she was. This was what she did best. The presentation flowed like a well-rehearsed symphony. Claire opened by discussing the challenges of AI implementation in legacy systems, capturing the audience's attention with real-world examples and pitfalls everyone recognized. Alexander then smoothly transitioned, presenting innovative solutions Cascade had developed, his natural charisma keeping people engaged. By the time they reached the final case study, Claire saw heads nodding, people eagerly taking notes. During the Q&A session, an executive from the field stood up. Question for Ms. Madison. How do you deal with resistance from teams accustomed to traditional processes? Claire smiled, recognizing a challenge she had faced countless times. Cultural change is always the most difficult hurdle, even more so than technical challenges. What worked for us was starting with smaller pilot projects, demonstrating concrete value before scaling up. People resist abstract changes, but they embrace results. And, Alexander added, having leaders like Claire, who understand both the technical and human sides, makes all the difference. She built a team that trusts her because she never implements changes without understanding the impact. The public praise made her blush slightly, but she maintained her composure, acknowledging it with a nod. When the presentation ended with vigorous applause, several people approached, wanting to continue the conversation. Claire found herself surrounded by executives asking questions, requesting business cards, suggesting future discussions. It was gratifying, validating in ways she hadn't expected. Alexander was a few feet away in his own conversation, but his eyes met hers across the crowd. And in his gaze she saw genuine pride, not the possessive kind from someone threatened by her success, but the kind that celebrated her achievements as if they were shared. The afternoon quickly passed in a series of smaller meetings, hallway conversations, and strategic networking. When they finally returned to the hotel late in the afternoon, both were exhausted, but energized. In the lobby, Alexander paused. Business dinner with the European investors is at 8, but before then, are you free? Claire checked her phone. It was 5:30. A couple of hours free. Want to take a walk? There's a beautiful park nearby. We can decompress before the next corporate performance. The word performance made her smile. It was exactly what it felt like sometimes, playing a role, wearing the professional mask. Yes. Give me 15 minutes to change. 20 minutes later, they were walking through the Boston Public Garden, the golden late afternoon light filtering through the trees. Claire had swapped her formal blazer for a light blouse, and Alexander wore only a casual shirt. Away from corporate settings, they looked like just two people enjoying an autumn afternoon. You were incredible today, Alexander said as they rounded the ornamental pond. The way you commanded that room. I saw people literally leaning forward not to miss a word. We were good together, Claire corrected. The presentation worked because we complemented each other. That's true. He paused near an arched bridge, turning to face her. Claire, I know this is a complicated situation. I know there are risks to your career, your reputation. But I want you to know that I will never harm you professionally. If something between us doesn't work out, it won't affect your job. Claire studied his face, looking for signs of dishonesty and finding none. How can you promise that? Emotions are complicated. If we end badly, then we handle it like adults. But I'm not planning on ending badly. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. I'm planning on doing this right. Do what right? Us. The word hung between them, heavy with implications. I know it's early. I know we're still figuring this out. But Claire, when I look at you, I don't just see my VP. I see the woman who made me laugh in a bar in Vegas when I was having one of the worst nights of my life. I see someone who challenges me, who isn't afraid to disagree with me, who makes me want to be better at everything. Claire felt tears prick her eyes, which was ridiculous. She didn't cry, especially not in public. Alexander, you don't have to say anything right now, he gently interrupted. I just needed you to know." They stood there for a long moment, hands entwined, as swans glided gracefully on the pond behind them, and Claire realized she was stopping the fight. Against her feelings, against the possibilities, against the idea that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth the risk. "We should head back," she said finally, her voice a little hoarse. "We need to get ready for dinner." Alexander nodded but didn't release her hand as they walked back to the hotel. And when they finally parted ways in the hallway, heading to their respective rooms, Claire felt something fundamental shift within her. She had stopped seeing this as a complication she needed to manage, and started seeing it as something worth protecting. The dinner with the European investors was an elaborate dance of corporate diplomacy and subtle strategy. Claire watched Alexander navigate the conversations with a skill she was starting to recognize as natural to him. He made people feel important, listened with genuine attention, and then guided discussions exactly where he wanted, without them realizing they were being led. She herself contributed when appropriate, offering technical insights that complemented Alexander's strategic visions. The investors, 3 men and 1 woman representing funds from London and Paris, were visibly impressed by her mastery of operational details. "We rarely see executives who understand both the big picture and granular execution," commented Margot Dubois, the French investor, her astute eyes flicking between Claire and Alexander. "How long have you two been working together?" The question was innocent on the surface, but Claire sensed the curiosity behind it. There was something in the dynamic between her and Alexander that had evidently shone through, some chemistry that wasn't entirely professional. "Actually, only a few weeks," Alexander replied smoothly. "Cascade's acquisition was finalized recently, but Claire built that division over 6 years. I merely had the good fortune to inherit her expertise." The way he deflected the credit to her, naturally and effortlessly, made something warm in Claire's chest. It wasn't performative or calculated. It was genuine. When dinner finally wrapped up close to midnight, Claire felt the exhaustion in her bones. 3 days of presentations, strategic meetings, and emotional balancing had taken their toll. In the car back to the hotel, she let her head fall against the headrest, closing her eyes. "Tired?" Alexander's voice was soft in the dark of the car. "Exhausted," she admitted, "but it was productive. Margot is definitely interested in a larger partnership. She was impressed with you. Everyone was." There was something in his voice that made her open her eyes. He was watching her with that familiar intensity. "Claire, can I ask you something?" "Depends on the question." A smile played on his lips. "Fair enough. What are you thinking right now?" And not the corporate answer about mergers or market strategies. You. What are you feeling? Claire considered the question, allowing herself to be honest. "I'm thinking this trip changed something. I don't know exactly what yet, but something fundamental. For better or worse? I don't know." She held his gaze. "It scares me a little. I like control, knowing exactly where I stand. And with you, I feel like I'm constantly on the verge of something I can't quite name." Alexander reached out, his fingers finding hers in the space between them. "I know how scary it is. But I also know that the best things in my life came from taking leaps even when I couldn't see where I'd land." The car pulled up in front of the hotel. They rode up in silence, the tension between them growing with each floor. When they reached the 12th floor hallway, Claire felt each step as if she were walking toward an inevitable decision. At her room door she paused, the key card in her hand. Alexander stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, waiting. Always waiting for her to set the pace, she realized. Even when it was clear he wanted more, he never pushed. "Alexander," she began, her voice lower than she intended. "This trip ends tomorrow. We go back to Seattle, back to reality, back to the office where you're my CEO and I work for you. I know, and I don't know how to navigate that. How to be professional when all I can think about is—" She paused, struggling for words. "Is what?" He took a step closer, but still didn't touch her. Claire took a deep breath, making the decision she knew was risky but necessary. When all I can think about is you. How it felt to be with you in Vegas. How every moment of these past few days has made me want to forget all the reasons why this is complicated. His eyes darkened. Claire. No. She raised her hand, stopping him. Let me finish. I've spent my entire life being cautious, planning every step, avoiding risks, and it's brought me here, given me a career I love, but it's also left me alone. So maybe for once, I need to stop thinking so much and just feel. She slid the card into the door, pushing it open. Then she turned to Alexander, holding out her hand. Stay with me tonight. For a moment, he just looked at her, and Claire saw so many emotions cross his face. Surprise, desire, and something deeper that made her tremble. Then he took her hand, their fingers intertwining. Are you sure? He asked, his voice hoarse. No. She pulled him into the room, closing the door behind them. But I'm doing it anyway. And then he was kissing her, and all the uncertainties melted under the heat between them. His hands found her face, gentle but urgent, and she responded by pulling him closer, needing to feel his solid body against hers. It was different from Vegas, where there was the protection of anonymity. Here, they knew each other, understood the complications, and chose this anyway. The night unfolded in moments of discovery and reconnection. Alexander was tender in ways that surprised her, his hands exploring as if memorizing every inch of her. He murmured things in her ear that made her tremble, not just words of desire, but of genuine admiration. And when they finally came together, it was with an intensity that left her breathless, feeling more alive than she had in years. Afterward, lying entwined in the tangled sheets, Claire traced patterns on his chest while he stroked her back in slow, comforting movements. Will you regret this in the morning? Alexander asked softly. Claire considered the question honestly. I don't know. Ask me tomorrow. He chuckled, the sound reverberating through his chest. Fair enough. But right now, in this moment, she lifted her head to look at him. I don't regret it. His eyes held hers, serious now. Claire, when we get back to Seattle, I want to do this right. Talk to HR. Follow all the appropriate protocols. I don't want you to feel like your career is at risk or that there's anything hidden and shameful about this. What if people judge? What if they think I'm sleeping my way to the top? Then they're idiots who don't know you. His voice was fierce. But I understand the concern. That's why we'll be transparent. Follow every rule. And if at any point you feel this is professionally harming you, we'll pause until we find a better solution. The consideration in his words, his willingness to prioritize her career even when he clearly wanted this as much as she did, made something loosen within Claire. Maybe she could trust this. Trust him. Have you ever done this before? She asked. Gotten involved with someone from work? No. The answer was immediate. I've always kept those parts of my life completely separate. But I've also never met anyone like you. Claire snuggled against him, allowing herself to completely relax for the first time in days. This is still terrifying. I know, but at least we're terrified together. She eventually drifted off to sleep, listening to the steady beat of his heart, feeling anchored in ways she hadn't expected. Morning arrived with soft light filtering through the curtains. Claire woke to find Alexander already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart clench. Good morning, he murmured, brushing her hair away from her face. Good morning. She checked the clock. 6:15. The flight back was scheduled for noon. I should go back to my room. Pack. Probably. But neither of them moved. Finally, Claire forced herself to get up, finding her clothes scattered on the floor. Alexander watched her get dressed, something playing on his lips. What? She asked. Nothing. Just memorizing this. You in the morning, completely disheveled and perfect. Claire threw a pillow at him, laughing despite the blush on her cheeks. "You're ridiculous. Ridiculously in love with you, perhaps." The word stopped her at the door. She turned, meeting his now serious eyes. "Alexander." "Too soon?" he asked softly. "Sorry, but it's true." Claire walked back across the room, leaning down to kiss him one last time. "Give me time to process all this, but it's not one-sided." The smile that lit up his face made every complication worth it. Hours later, on the private jet flying back to Seattle, they maintained appropriate distance, working on separate laptops, occasionally discussing business points. To any observer, they would simply be a CEO and VP, returning from a successful business trip. But as the jet began its descent, Alexander closed his laptop and leaned forward. "Monday, first thing, I'm going to talk to HR, officially declare our relationship, ensure there are no conflicts of interest in evaluation processes." Claire nodded, appreciating the methodical approach even as anxiety nibbled at her edges. "And in the office? Professional, always. No one needs to know personal details beyond what's necessary for compliance." He paused. "But Claire, I'm not going to hide that I care about you. I'll just make sure it's done appropriately." The landing was smooth, Seattle greeting them with typical overcast skies. In the car back to the city, Claire watched familiar landscapes pass by, feeling strangely changed despite having only been away for 3 days. Her phone vibrated, a text from Marcus. "Welcome back. How was Boston?" Claire smiled, typing, "Productive. I'll tell you the details tomorrow." "Some details," she mentally corrected. "Not all." When the driver pulled up in front of her building, Alexander got out of the car too, insisting on carrying her bag to the door. In the lobby, he paused. "Dinner this week?" he asked, his voice casual but his eyes intense. "Not business, just us." "I'd like that," Claire replied honestly. He leaned in, kissing her forehead softly, a gesture that somehow felt more intimate than anything they had shared. "Get some rest. I'll see you Monday." In her apartment, Claire dropped her bag and walked to the windows, watching the city stretch out below. Her life had been so predictable, so controlled. And now she was embarking on something completely uncertain, risking the stability she had so carefully built. But as she looked at her reflection in the glass, she saw something different. She saw a woman who was finally allowing herself to live, not just exist. She saw possibilities instead of just plans, and for the first time in years, she wasn't scared of what she couldn't control. She was excited to find out. On Monday, when Claire walked into the office, she noticed a few curious glances. Marcus appeared at her doorway almost immediately. "So?" he asked, flopping into the chair. "Was Boston really just business?" Claire smiled, choosing her words carefully. "It was productive, and complicated, and promising." Marcus studied her face. "You look different. Lighter, perhaps." "Maybe I am," Claire admitted. "Sometimes risks are worth it." Her phone showed a text from Alexander. "HR at 10. After that, everything's official." Claire replied, "Ready when you are." And when Alexander passed her office at 10:15, waving through the glass with a smile that promised more conversations ahead, Claire knew for sure. She had stopped running and finally started building something real. And whatever the outcome, she was ready to face it. No longer as the executive who always needed to be in control, but as a woman who finally understood that sometimes the best things in life come when you allow yourself to be vulnerable enough to love.